Okay, great. So good evening, everyone. It's 7 p.m., so we're going to get started. My name is Paul Ligety, and I am the Vice President of the Historical Society of West Windsor, which is a nonprofit founded in 1983, dedicated to preserving and promoting our town's history. It's wonderful to see the turnout here. We had over 100 people sign up, and hopefully you're all here to view the 10 Crucial Days lecture, which covers the period of the American Revolution between December 25th, 1776, and January 3rd, 1777. That saved the American Revolution during some of its darkest hours. Our guest speaker is author and historian Larry Kidder, a preeminent scholar on the American Revolution. He's written books on the subject, is involved in several historical organizations, and gives history tours. I actually first heard of him when I went on an 8-hour 10 Crucial Days historic bus tour, so you can understand that there's a lot, obviously a lot of information to be talked about. So, next slide. This lecture is just one of several dozen events that the Historical Society is planning to undertake to commemorate West Windsor's 225th birthday, which is this year. Throughout 2022, our Year 225 Planning Committee will be working with several local organizations to oversee events such as this lecture, reenactments, history tours, and much more. You can see more in the calendar below on the screen, which is also available for viewing at the link below the calendar. At this link, you can learn a lot more about our upcoming plans, how to join our planning committee, and how to provide support as an individual or institutional sponsor. Speaking of which, I'd like to thank Princeton University, which is one of our sponsors, who has recently committed to providing a very generous donation for the purpose of installing permanent cast metal historic educational signage in each of West Windsor's oldest communities, such as Dutch Neck, Princeton Junction, Growers Mill, and so on. And this is an important point to make. This calendar only highlights the events that we have, but we actually have a number of ongoing historic preservation and education projects as well, which will be unveiled later this year. And the one that I'm particularly excited about is an upcoming West Windsor history book. So go back. So I would strongly encourage all of you, if you haven't already done so, to follow us on Facebook and Instagram. We also have a website, westwindsorhistory.com, which is a great resource to learn about local history and you can learn there about how to join and support the Historical Society. We will be frequently updating all 3 sites as more events and projects are unveiled. So, please check in there. Within a few days, we'll also be unveiling a few more events happening later this month, as well as Year 225 memorabilia, which you can purchase to support the Historical Society and show off your township pride. I want to give a particular shout out to Unified Spectrum, who made our Year 225 mugs, which you can see in the lower part of the screen. They're an organization that employs differently abled adults from WWP to make personalized gifts and products. Finally, some things to point out about this meeting: your videos and microphones are disabled. However, you will be able to ask questions using the Zoom chat function, which is the little speech bubble icon usually found at the bottom of your screen. So click on that to ask questions. Maggie Walsh, our community outreach lead, as well as myself, we are available to answer any tech support question. If you can't use the chat for whatever reason, you can also send us an email at the email you see here, westwindsorhistory@gmail.com, to ask anything, tech support, or for example, if you can't use the chat and you want to ask a question for Larry. We will also have a question and answer session after Larry's lecture at the end, where Maggie and I will read off the questions you post in the chat. We apologize in advance if we can't get to everyone's questions, given the number of audience members. And I know that it's kind of hard to show support with your mics muted, but to whatever extent you can, please give Larry Kidder a warm welcome. And thank you, Larry, very much for being here, and take it away.
Hey, thank you very much. Glad to be with you all tonight, and I think I'm going to go to the screen share here. Oops. Okay, everybody hopefully can see my screen now, and we'll get started. Again, I'm really happy to be with you tonight. This, of course, is an appropriate night to be doing this, January 3rd, because the 10 Crucial Days, this was the 10th of those days back in 1777. So it's really nice to be doing it. It's also nice to be doing it for you guys at West Windsor, because what was happening in the 10 crucial days was very much a part of what was happening to the people in living in West Windsor at that time. And it's something that I'm still learning about. And I know that Paul and Maggie and everybody, are continuing to try to flesh out the story of West Windsor's role during the 10 crucial days and other parts of the revolution. I'll be mentioning some of those things tonight, at least in a general sense, and then maybe in the question period and get more detailed on some things. But anyway, let's get started with George Washington's 10 crucial days. I think it's important to take a look at what led up to those days, not just a couple of days, but actually months. The New York campaign of 1776, which really started out right about the time of the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence was read in New York City and Manhattan to American troops who were stationed there at the time to hopefully prevent the British from taking over New York. They'd kind of driven the British out of Boston, and they were the British had just kind of started arriving in the New York harbor and unloading troops on Staten Island in order to begin that movement. And so the Declaration of Independence reading had, I'm sure a lot of emotion at the time, because it was a statement of independence, but also that independence was already being threatened at the time. So there's going to be some battles that take place in this area. The Battle of Brooklyn in late August, a month and a half or so after the Declaration of Independence. Then in the middle of September, the Battle of Harlem Heights. And then at the end of October, the Battle of White Plains. So we've gone, 3 months here from Battle of Brooklyn to the Battle of White Plains. And then the next month, November, is going to be Washington's retreat across New Jersey. And then his, if you will, the first crossing of the Delaware in the first week of December to get his troops over to the Bucks County area. And of course, he was followed by the British. So once Washington was across, he didn't want to keep retreating. He wanted to, even though it was the end of the campaign season in December, he wanted to keep the war going and hopefully reverse things so that he wasn't always retreating and being defeated. So he came up with this idea to attack Trenton. And I'd like to explore that decision a little bit and just why he wanted to attack Trenton and why he wanted to do it around Christmas time in 1776. So the situation in December on December 25th, on Christmas Day itself, was the armed conflict with the British had been going on since April 19th, the battles of Lexington and Concord, and since certainly independence had been declared on July 2nd. They heard that declaration, but I think it was July 8th in New York City. The British had now occupied much of New Jersey. With that retreat across New Jersey in November, the British followed in behind the Americans, and really anybody involved in the New Jersey state government that had been established right around the time of the Declaration of Independence was pretty much running for their life, because they were, they had prices on their head for being patriots and whatnot. So the state government of New Jersey was not functioning. The governor of New Jersey, William Livingston, could not be found. They don't know if he left the state or if he was just in some remote area, but nobody really knew where he was. So as Thomas Paine wrote, just about this time, just shortly before, these were the times that tried men's souls, because it looked like the revolution was pretty much on its last legs. Both sides, both the British and the American side, felt that the revolution would be over within a few months, and it looked like the British were going to be on the winning side. However, the British had put themselves in a situation where Washington could analyze their troop dispositions and see that they were in some vulnerable situations, Trenton being one of them. So if you take a look at the map of New Jersey in December of '76, you see the British did occupy the New York area completely. And then there was a number of towns across the state where the British had troops stationed, a regiment or two or four or five throughout the state. And I've kind of indicated which towns had what regiments. And they're kind of connected, as you see, by a pink line here, that as far as Washington was concerned, he could look at that and basically see a line of dominoes, because the troops in any one of those towns, be it Trenton, be it Brunswick, be it Elizabethtown, Hackensack, wherever it was, he had more troops. Even though his army was smaller than it had been, he had more troops than any of those individual British cantonments. But if they all got together, if they all combined their forces, then he would be totally outnumbered. So he was going to have to act in a way that he would prevent the British from consolidating. But at this point, the area that I've just shown you, the shaded area, is approximately the area that was controlled by the British, and gives an indication why the government had pretty much ceased to function in New Jersey. Now, why attack Trenton on December 26th? He had to get back into New Jersey. He had to attack because the Patriots in New Jersey felt completely unsupported. Washington and his Continental Army were in another state right now, in Pennsylvania. And this meant that the Loyalists, whom the Patriots had been not very nice to since they had taken control of the government, the Loyalists felt empowered and emboldened to get revenge on the Patriots, because they now had the British Army on their side. The Continental Congress from Philadelphia felt threatened by that British occupation of New Jersey, and had moved to Baltimore, Maryland. So if Washington is going to keep his revolution going in any way for the next few months, he can't just sit in Bucks County. He has to do something to restore the feelings of security on the part of those people who support the revolution, especially those in New Jersey, but others as well. Now, the army that he has to do this with is not in good shape. Everybody knows about the shoe problems and the bloody feet and the ragged uniforms, etc. But these soldiers have gone through a series of defeats and retreats. Their morale is not all that high. The army has shrunk from about 20,000 when they started all that activity around New York City, down to about 3,000 or so. A number of troops had been captured in battle, had been killed in battle, wounded in battle, or had become sick. Even more of them had become sick than any of those other ways that the soldiers disappeared. And some of the soldiers had simply gotten frustrated and deserted. So he's down in his troop numbers. The troops that he does have, however, are kind of tough guys. They're survivors, and they're good men, except that they are tired, discouraged, and don't have all the equipment and everything else that they need. In addition, these men are short timers in the Army. Their enlistments are going to end on December 31st. So Washington, if he wants to do anything to get the British out of New Jersey, is going to have to do it very quickly. If it's December 24th, 25th, he's only got about 6-7 days in order to use these troops that he has, the remainder. This army is in bad shape because of a number of things besides having been in battle. The responsibility for these soldiers is divided between 13 individual states and a 14th entity, the Continental Congress. The states and the Continental Congress are still in some ways arguing among themselves over who's responsible for what in taking care of the army. And this, of course, is not helping with those supply issues and everything else. As a result, these soldiers who signed a contract to enlist for a certain number of time, they were expecting the contract to be fulfilled by the other side, which was their pay, their food, their clothing, and their equipment. And this hadn't really come to pass. This is one reason why a number of soldiers had deserted. They're saying, hey, I'm doing what I agreed to do, but the other side isn't doing what they agreed to do. So this was hurting things. And now the soldiers are looking at wintertime, and with the lack of equipment and the lack of clothing and shoes, etc., and the weather getting bad, they're just getting ready to leave. They're looking at the end of their enlistments and saying, I'll stick out a couple of days, or a couple of weeks, but pretty soon I'm going to be gone. Now, because that army was going to be gone, back in September, the Continental Congress had authorized essentially a new Continental Army. And the men who enlisted in that army were going to have to enlist for really the duration of the war initially. And then the Congress changed it to at least 3 years, and possibly 3 years or the duration of the war. But anyway, they're going to be committed to the military for a long time. But who's going to enlist when all they've seen from the army is being defeated? Lack of pay, lack of clothing, lack of food, the whole thing. How are you going to get new men to enlist? Washington needs to show that his troops can succeed. And the only way he can do that is to go back into New Jersey and win some things. To do that, he sees right across the river from him at Trenton, one of those cantonments that he's going to outnumber. There's about 1,500 Hessian troops in Trenton and in the area of Trenton. Another 1,500 or so south of Trenton, down by Bordentown and Burlington. And then even a few more Hessians up in Princeton and the West Windsor area that he's going to have to worry about. But these soldiers that are in Trenton are often thought, well, why were they put there? Why at the end of the line, closest to the enemy troops, being Washington's troops, why would General Howe put foreigners there instead of his crack British troops? Well, in fact, the Hessians that he put there were crack troops. They had shown outstanding performance in that New York campaign, and literally being stationed at Trenton, which was on the left end of the British line across New Jersey, they were in a position of honor. And if Howe hadn't put them there, it would have been an insult. So that's one reason he did. However, many of these very qualified soldiers have the problem that they are fatigued and they are sick. They have had a long campaign also. They are missing shoes. Their uniforms need replacements. In many ways, they're pretty much comparable to the American troops. Also, their boss, Colonel Johann Rall, made a bunch of mistakes with them that I'm sure Washington was aware of. He had split his troops throughout the town of Trenton. Trenton was just a small place at that time, King Street and Queen Street being the two main streets. Queen Street was on the main route between New England and the southern colonies, the main route between New York and Philadelphia. So, it's a main street, but it's still a small town. And Rall split his troops into by barracking them in private homes, in churches, public buildings, but they were all over the place in this town. And they also had their dependents with them. We don't often think about this, but there were Hessian wives and children at Trenton also. They had camp followers, just like all 18th century armies did. And there also had been a number of civilian loyalists who came to town to help the Hessians. Again, the loyalists feel empowered. They're going to do everything they can to help the British and the Hessians. They're going to tell the Hessians, which farmers outside of Trenton were patriots whose farms can be plundered, now, and things like that. So they're going to be helpful. Where they were staying was probably at the old barracks. One of the myths of the 10 crucial days in the Battle of Trenton is that the Hessians were stationed in the old barracks. There is no evidence of that. But there's also no evidence of where their dependents stayed, and being an open building, that's probably where they were. The old barracks is also very near the river, and Colonel Rawl did not want to station troops too close to the river because the Americans had artillery just across the river. And I think he figured that if women and children were in that building, the Americans wouldn't try to destroy it. If he had soldiers there, that'd be something else. Now, the Hessians in Trenton were not happy. It's wintertime. They're not supposed to be thinking about battle. They're supposed to be thinking about getting supplies, getting over all the illness, wounds healing, fixing equipment, repairing equipment, things like that. They're getting ready for the spring campaign, theoretically. This is downtime. However, Washington had been sending troops across the Delaware for a couple of weeks in mid-December in harassing attacks to attack Hessian parties out looking for food, to attack Hessian guard posts, reconnaissance platoons, things like that. And they would hit them, take a few, inflict a few casualties on the Hessians, and then get back across the river. So the Hessians were convinced that this was going to be a long winter of harassment attacks, and nothing much bigger than that. They also felt that they weren't in winter quarters, that they were still on campaign. So there's not going to be a lot of relaxation. There isn't going to be any partying. They're going to be constantly on alert for these harassment attacks. The same thing is going to be in the South, where some troops under Colonel Griffith, coming out of the Philadelphia area, harassed the troops down in the Burlington, Bristol, Mount Holly, Morristown area, just as the Washington's troops are harassing them around Trenton. Now, when is he going to attack Trenton? You've got here a nice Christmas party, and the myth is that Washington wanted to attack on December 25th because the Hessians would all be partying. However, the real truth of it is that Washington was waiting till a point in December when he had his full complement of troops that were available to him. And so he needed to be reinforced by troops under General Sullivan and troops that had come from Fort Ticonderoga. Those troops under Sullivan had been under General Lee. And if you remember, General Lee had kept troops in the New York area above New York City when Washington was crossing the state of New Jersey. And Washington kept asking him, come on and help out. And Lee kept resisting that. But then after Lee was captured at Morristown in mid-December, Sullivan took over and he made sure his troops got to Washington. They only got to Washington, though, a couple of days before Christmas. So it was by December 25th that Washington had all the pieces together for his attack. And it's going to have to be soon because of the enlistments running out at the end of December. So that's why it was Christmas when he attacked, not because of the partying in town. Now, how's he going to attack? Well, he had a very complex plan. He was going to have multiple attacks, try to use the element of surprise as much as possible. And in any way, he was going to try to overpower the Hessians with his artillery, as well as with more manpower. Now, why is he going to cross one of his forces at Mcconkey's Ferry? Well, we all know about the Durham Boats. We know about the Leutze painting that shows something pretending to be a Durham boat. Looks more like a little rowboat. But the Durham boats were large, anywhere from 40 feet to 60 feet long, roughly. They were built to carry heavy loads, iron ore, gravel, things like that. So they were very sturdy, and they were very used to being employed on the Delaware River, going up and down the river. I think it's important to recognize that they were up and down the river boats. They weren't go across the river boats. They could do that, but that wasn't what their purpose was. To go across the river, a more suitable craft was the ferry boat, particularly for horses, particularly for wagons, artillery pieces, things like that, because you're not going to put a cannon, its limber, the horses that pull it, all of its ammunition and stuff like that. You're not going to put that in a Durham boat. The horses particularly are just not going to be able to be put aboard and get off easily. So the ferry boats were designed to carry wagons and horse-drawn wagons as well as individuals. So that's what they're going to use, and that's why they crossed at a ferry. The ferry required a rope across the river that was attached to the craft itself, and then could use the current and poles and things like that to get across. The photograph that I put up in the lower left-hand corner is obviously not from the Revolution period, but it's 19th century and shows that the ferries were still operating in exactly the same way that they were during the Revolution. The picture of Washington sitting on his horse in the upper left hand, I think is the major inaccuracy in that painting. The horses were not secure on these boats, and you wouldn't want to have been trying to ride one. The picture in the lower right-hand corner showing unmounted horses, I think, is a lot more accurate. I think the picture of Washington standing by an artillery piece in the upper right hand is also not accurate, because they would not have disconnected the artillery piece from its limber and the horses. They would have just marched the whole thing right on there instead of taking it apart and then reassembling it on the other side. So it would be like the picture you see in the lower left-hand corner. Everything's still hooked together. So anyway, the crossings are going to take place the late afternoon and evening of December 25th. Start having problems right away. The crossing at Philadelphia is never going to happen. The commander there just decided he didn't have enough troops and it just wasn't going to work, and he needed to guard Philadelphia. The two crossings at Bristol and at just below Trenton, they're going to run into ice problems that they can't deal with. They're going to have very different ice problems than Washington had up at Johnson and Mcconkey's Ferry. So Washington's going to be the only one who gets across. I got a big X there by Ewing. The reason the ice is different below Trenton than above Trenton is because Trenton is at the falls in the river. So south of Trenton, the river is tidal. It oscillates back and forth in depth and current and that sort of thing. Whereas above Trenton, the current is constantly flowing south and in a pretty steady manner. So those differences in water movement and that kind of thing make for different ice formations. And Washington was the lucky guy here. He had the easier time to get across. Not that it was easy, but it was easier than the others had. So he's going to cross at Johnson Mcconkey's Ferry, and then he's going to march the 9 miles, splitting his army into 2 divisions to hit Trenton from 2 ends. So in this map of Trenton, you see him hitting the gray arrows at the top are his troops. The gray arrows coming in from the left are his troops. The black arrows represent Hessians. The squiggly ones at the top are Hessians retreating into town from the outpost, and you've got the same thing coming in from the left. The solid arrows in the middle are the Hessians trying to form up and create a defense for these American troops coming in. And again, Rawle's mistakes, one of the mistakes he made was not giving his officers a real good plan. So they were just going by the seat of their pants, trying to organize things. His men break into really 2 groups, 2 regiments with him, the R and the L there, the Rawle and the Lossberg Regiment, and then the K Regiment, just to the bottom of them, the Kniefhausen Regiment. And you can see that they are getting hit from many directions by Washington's troops. Rawle is going to have to surrender. He's going to surrender first. He is mortally wounded, and his troops surrender, but the Knyphausen Regiment continues on for a while until they are surrounded, and then they surrender. So the Hessians surrender in two groups. Now, at this point, Washington really wants to get those Hessians back over the river into Pennsylvania so that he can send them to Philadelphia and then to Lancaster County as POWs, so that he can then go on and maybe attack Princeton and some other areas. He's hoping that his men from those two lower crossings got across and they would join him at Trenton and carry the battle on. But notice these arrows. The gray arrow again is the Americans, the black arrows are the Hessians. Notice the made arrow is both black and gray. That's Washington taking the Hessian prisoners back to Bucks County, to Newtown. And the arrow that shows what he wanted to do, just wasn't going to work. So the black arrows, however, some Hessians did escape. They were not captured. And the Hessians down by Burlington were not captured. They headed for Princeton area. So guess where they went through? They went through West Windsor in many ways. In their efforts to get to Princeton and other areas in that space where they would be away from Washington and his troops. So once Washington gets back over to Newtown area with his prisoners, he still needs to get back to New Jersey. He still needs to convince men to extend their enlistments or to enlist in the new regiments. And he needs to make use of militia units that, because of his victory at Trenton, have flocked to him to try to help out. So he does cross back over the next couple of days and stations his troops at Trenton, Bordentown, Crosswicks area. And the British pretty much stay about where they were. You can see some of those, the red dots, in the towns where they had been before. However, the British want revenge, and Washington wants to get moving and try to get some more victory. So the British start consolidating their troops at Princeton. Now, I can tell you, when they consolidate at Princeton, some of those troops, there's going to be close to 10,000 of them. They are going to spill over into West Windsor area. So they're going to be camping out in West Windsor, as well as in the Princeton area. All areas around Princeton are going to have troops. That means that farmers are going to have fences torn up for the British soldiers to have fires for warmth and cooking. Farmers are going to lose stored crops. They're going to lose animals that the British are going to butcher for food and things like that. So all the people in the Princeton area are going to suffer greatly. They've already been suffering because of that long British occupation with just a couple of thousand, but now it's enlarged to close to 10. Washington is going to consolidate on January 1st all of his troops at Trenton. And he's going to send about 1,000 of them up towards Princeton with the idea that when Cornwallis brings his thousands of troops down towards Trenton, that those 1,000 troops will delay, not get into a main battle, but harass Cornwallis so that it takes a long time for him to get to Trenton. So the morning of January 2nd, the British troops, about 8,000 of them or so, leave Princeton and head down what's today's Route 206 to Trenton. Notice the blue area at Trenton shows Washington's disposition of troops on the far side of the Assunpink Creek from the main town of Trenton. He's got his troops all established there. He's got artillery. He's ready to force the British into kind of a Bunker Hill attack, where they're going to have to attack uphill at him, and his men are going to be entrenched and ready for them. But as the British head south, those troops that Washington had sent north are stationed at every place that a river or a creek crosses the road. And again, this is just going to be a harassing attack, not something to take the British head on. But each time the British run into one of these bodies, they have to deploy, they have to fire for a while, they have to force the men to retreat, and then the men take up another location and are forced to retreat. And you can see by the time elements here, it's taking hours to go from Princeton to Trenton. It's taking them all day, and they don't get to Trenton till around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And of course, in midwinter like this, it's going to be an early sunset. So the British come into Trenton and are ready to attack across the Assunpink Creek at the Americans. At that point, there's really only one place to get across the creek, and that's at a stone bridge at a grist mill. And you see here from this illustration, the bridge and the mill. It's where Broad Street crosses the Assunpink today. And there is going to be some fighting back and forth across the creek. The British are going to try to get troops across the bridge several times, and the Americans are going to force them back. The British take very severe casualties here. But it gets so dark that both sides decide to call it off. The cannonade back and forth is the last part of the action, but then both sides decide to set up camp and get the soldiers a meal and get them some rest, and they'll continue the battle in the morning. However, Washington decides at the Douglas House, where he has a war council with his officers, that he's going to go on and attack the 1,500 or so troops that he knows the British left behind guarding supplies and kind of a rear guard back at Princeton. So around midnight, Washington gives the command very quietly. It's practically whispered to his men to leave. And he's worked out with some local militiamen the route that will get them to Princeton the best without and able to avoid the British encampment. And so they take off and they spend all night marching towards Princeton. The British do know that they left, but Cornwallis mistakenly decides or concludes that they are just going to reestablish their lines for the battle the next morning, not that they're going to leave the area completely. So he got kind of tricked. So about 7 o'clock in the morning, the American troops are getting close to Princeton, and they are traveling really through parts of West Windsor. By the way, it's important to note that during that time that Washington was combining his troops at Trenton in those days before this battle, he had sent patrols out, which included patrols in West Windsor, who one of them in a very well-known action was able to capture half a dozen or so British troops and bring them back to Trenton and learn about the British dispositions in Princeton. And that, along with some other patrols, allowed him to know exactly what he was getting into in terms of British defensive positions and that sort of thing in Princeton. So about 7 o'clock in the morning, he's down at the Stony Brook at the intersection with what was known as the Sawmill Road and the Quaker Road, Quaker Bridge Road. And the arrows that you see here are his plan for attacking Princeton. This is not how he did it. This was his plan that he was explaining to his officers at 7 o'clock in the morning. The main thing that he did initially was to send Colonel Hossiger, whom you see on the left-hand arrow going towards Princeton. He sent him out early because he was going to have the longest trek in order to get to the other side of Princeton, and he got started quickly. That was good because at the same time Washington is getting set to go here, about 1,000 of the 1,500 or so British troops left in Princeton were leaving town and going south to meet up with Cornwallis to carry on the battle of the second day here. And they missed seeing Hossiger. He got across before they came down. However, Washington is now marching parallel, but in the opposite direction to this British force. And they couldn't see each other until about 8 o'clock, when the British troops got across Stony Brook and marched up the hill, what was Cochrane's Hill, to where today the golf club Jasna Polana is. And at that point, they were high enough that they could look for some distance, given the fact that there weren't as many trees back then as there are today, because it was mostly farmland. And the rising sun glinted off the metal equipment on the troops under Washington that were marching on the Sawmill Road. Likewise, the troops on the Sawmill Road, when they were looking across, could see the sun glinting off metal pieces of equipment that the British had on Cochrane's Hill. So both sides see each other just about the same time. The Americans, of course, are not expecting to see any British. They think the British are all down in Trenton. The British are not expecting to see any Americans because they think the Americans are all down in Trenton. So both are surprised, and both commanders have to figure out what to do. I think it's very important to note that the British troops were only about 1,000, and Washington's troops are a lot closer to 5,000. So Washington really has the advantage in numbers. Now, Lieutenant Colonel Mahood, who's in charge of the 17th Regiment of Foot, has to make the decision. Does he go on to Trenton, or does he turn around and try to protect Princeton from whoever these guys are? And he has no idea how many that are marching up the Sawmill Road. He decides he needs to protect Princeton, so he turns around and starts heading back that way. But as he does that, he breaks off, as you see here, some troops of the 17th Regiment and some light dragoons, some who are mounted and some who are dismounted, and sends them across the farm towards those American troops to kind of figure out who they are and maybe get rid of them if it's not too many. Washington, at the same time, has decided to send General Mercer and a couple hundred troops across those same farm fields to go intercept what he thought might be a British patrol on the main road on Route 206. He doesn't know how many British troops are there. So these two groups are heading towards each other, not knowing what they're going to run into. Well, about the orchard of the William Clark farm, they run into each other and start the battle. They open fire. After the initial exchange of gunfire, musket fire, the British do what the British were accustomed to doing, and they did a bayonet charge on Mercer's troops. Mercer's troops had very few bayonets to counteract with. So they were pretty much taken aback, and you see the squiggly arrows, of their beginning of a retreat. Colonel Cadwallader, with even more troops, mostly Philadelphia militia, comes to help him out, and he has an artillery piece, and together they pretty much stop the British overthrow of Mercer's troops. Mercer, by the way, has been mortally wounded by this point with bayonets. His second in command, Colonel Hazlitt, has been killed outright with a bullet to the head. Both the British and the Americans have taken significant casualties. And things have gotten kind of into a stalemate there. But Washington has continued on up towards Princeton with most of his troops. He's also sent General Mifflin, as you see, over towards the main road to tear down the bridge over the Stony Brook, so that when Cornwallis comes up from Trenton, when he hears the battle, he will be delayed to get into it with the bridge down. So the stalemate is taking place, but Washington looks back and sees it and decides to peel off Hancock and Hand and their brigades, one from Pennsylvania, one from Rhode Island, and Washington leads them across the field. That's why I put Washington right at the head of the force there. Colonel Mifflin's troops send up a number of their men to attack the British on their right flank. So now the British are being attacked from three sides and they're outnumbered 4 or 5 to 1. So the only thing they can do at this point is retreat, get the heck out of there, and then either retreat down towards Trenton or retreat back up towards Princeton, or retreat into the woods and hope that the Americans don't find them. So it's really a bad defeat for the British. They have to leave the field. This is one of the first times in the Revolution that the British are going to actually leave the field of battle and leave it in control of the Americans. This painting by Don Traiani shows Washington at the head of those troops coming across the field into the British left flank. But now, once the battle is over, Washington can head towards Princeton. The British troops that have retreated to Princeton, or that were still stationed there, several hundred of them, try to come out and defend themselves at Frog Hollow outside of Princeton. But again, they're a couple hundred going up a couple thousand, and they have to retreat back into Princeton. And the battle basically ends in the town. And from there, Washington heads out to Morristown. And so after the Battle of Princeton, we want to compare the situation to what New Jersey was in December of '76. Again, the map that shows the British occupation. Now, in January 3rd and 4th, the map is different. Cornwallis has come up from Trenton and gone to Brunswick. Washington has left Princeton and gone to Morristown. So the American troops are going to be based for the winter at Morristown. But in addition to that, there are going to be American troops stationed throughout central New Jersey. There's going to be a camp, a depot of troops at Trenton and one at Princeton and a few other places, supplying those troops at Morristown and guiding troops coming up from the south, from those new regiments that are forming the new army. They come up through the American-held territory in New Jersey to join the army. And the British are pretty much compacted into a couple of cantonments that are left in New Brunswick. And you wouldn't want to have been a British soldier during the latter part of that year, because during the winter and into the early spring, we had what was known as the Forage War. And every time the British would send out patrols from Brunswick or from Elizabethtown, etc., American troops would attack them. And so the British never really had downtime in winter quarters. The Americans, to some degree, did at Morristown, because much of the attacks on the British cantonments were done by American militia, so that the new Continental Army could get itself together at Morristown. So things are looking a whole lot better after the 10 crucial days. Lord George Germain commented to Parliament in 1779 that whereas everything had looked great in December, it was only the time that tries men's souls for the Americans, not for the British. They were on top of the world. But then he said, all our hopes were blasted by that unhappy affair at Trenton, and then the 9 days that followed it to Princeton. Americans early on realized the significance of these 10 crucial days, and the citizens of Annapolis, Maryland, wrote to General Washington in December of 1781, just a couple of months after the victory at Yorktown. And they said, we derive particular pleasure from the contemplation that the successes at Trenton and Princeton, the 10 crucial days, laid the cornerstone of our freedom and independence, and that the capture of Earl Cornwallis and his army has completed the edifice and secured the temple of liberty to us and our posterity. These brilliant and important events are the most agreeable to every American, from the reflection that they were planned by and executed under the immediate command of Your Excellency. So not only did the new states declared themselves independence, not only are they looking much better and feeling much better, but Washington himself has gained in the respect of people and the confidence that people had in him. So it's confidence in the revolution, confidence in the military leader also. So that's basically the story that I wanted to tell you. I've written, as Paul said, a couple of books about it. All 5 of these books deal with it one way or another. Obviously, the middle book, The 10 Crucial Days, is the primary one, but all these books contain different points of view and different angles on the 10 Crucial Days, and specifically stories of the people who participated in them. The book on the right, by the way, The Revolutionary World of a Free Black Man, is my most recent book. It's only been available for a couple of weeks now. And it's the story of a free black man who fought at the Battle of Trenton in a Massachusetts regiment. He's interesting to us in New Jersey because he's probably the only free black man who fought at the Battle of Trenton, whose home was New Jersey. And he was one of the very few people born in New Jersey who fought at the battle. There were no New Jersey regiments at the Battle of Trenton, so it was unusual for a New Jerseyan to be in the battle. But anyway, that's the story, and I would love to have questions if we can do that.
Oh, yeah, thank you very much for that. That was very interesting and obviously relevant to the area. So I'm just going to go through the questions in order because we do have a few. For one of them, you must have, maybe I missed it, you must have made a reference to a Lee around 20 minutes or so in when you're talking about the Battle of Trenton.
Yeah.
That's the question, is that the same General Lee who was at Monmouth?
Yes. Yes, it's the same Charles Lee. Yeah. Yeah, Charles Lee had been with Washington through the New York campaign. And like I say, he was kind of a, what I want to say, he wanted to be Washington. He wanted to be commander-in-chief. And he felt that he was better. He was a he had retired British officer. And people looked at him as being the more talented one in many ways. And so when Washington kept asking him for help and during the retreat across New Jersey, Lee kept postponing going. He thought he might be able to attack the British from behind. He was looking for his own angles rather than trying to help Washington. But then Lee stopped at a tavern in Morristown overnight away from his troops and got captured by a British patrol. And then General Sullivan took over and got those troops to Washington. But he is the same troop. He's the same commander who's going to have problems at Monmouth also.
Okay, great. Now the next question is, did Washington himself cross Delaware on a ferry, and how many Durham boats were used by Washington's army on the Delaware?
Well, there were at least 20 Durham boats. We know that he collected that number, and there may have been others also. So I would say like a minimum of 20. Whether Washington crossed in a Durham boat or whether he crossed on a ferry boat is another question. I don't think anybody knows the answer. Could have been either. If he crossed on the ferry boat, he did not ride his horse. He was too good of a horseman to have gotten caught in that problem. But he also might have wanted to go with his horse in order to keep it calm, and that kind of thing. Although he did have other people. He had Billy Lee, for example, his slave who was with him all the time, who knew his horses very well also. So Billy might have done that. It is possible that Washington wanted to go with some troops in the Durham boat, but it's really hard to tell. And there's no eyewitness account of what boat he took.
Okay. The next question is actually apparently more of a geographical one. Someone's asking where Mcconkey's ferry was located, if it was closer to Washington's Crossing or further upriver towards New Hope.
Well, Mcconkey's ferry is Washington's Crossing. That's the Pennsylvania side of Washington Crossing Park. Johnson's Ferry is the New Jersey side at Washington Crossing Park. Now, the house that is the Mcconkey Ferry house today is not the one that was there at the time of the Revolution. It's on the site of the house, and there may be some foundations and, maybe some elements of the original ferry house still there. But that's basically a 19th century structure. And all the other houses, if you've ever been to the park there, there's like a little old town there. Those are all early 19th century developments. On the New Jersey side, the Johnson Ferry House at the park there was there at the time of the Battle of Trenton. It's the only structure still standing from the crossing in 1776.
Okay. The next question then is what were the chances of success on the what were the chances of success of the attack on Trenton, and what was Plan B if Washington led the Continental Army and lost that battle?
Well, that's really a good question. And the problem is we don't know what would have happened. Everything is guesswork here. Washington was in somewhat of a desperate situation here. Things were going to have to work or else. And what the or else would be, he would have had to take whatever troops he had left after being defeated at Trenton and tried to conduct, some kind of a guerrilla war, something like that, try to, collect troops again in some fashion. It would have been a mess. Whether they could have pulled things together again or not, is anybody's guess. He literally wanted, as I said, to not just have Trenton be a single battle. He wanted to be battle number one, and then a series of battles to follow to try to get the British out of New Jersey. But I think that the fact that he completely overpowered the British, keep in mind, he wanted to cross at 3 places and only one place got across. The troops with him outnumbered the British 2-1. If he'd had those other 2 crossings, he would have been 4 or 5-1 against the Hessians. So he had a lot of advantage. I think it's also important to note that with the influence of Henry Knox, he brought 18 artillery pieces to Trenton, 18 cannon and howitzers. The Hessians only had 6 cannon at Trenton. So he outnumbered them 3-1 in artillery. And one of the reasons he brought so much artillery, aside from the obvious one of wanting it to be a bigger firepower, once the storm set up during the crossing, it became even more important to have the artillery, because the artillery was known as a foul weather weapon. It was very hard to keep the powder dry for the muskets. It was not hard to keep the powder dry because of the way it was bagged up and contained and that sort of thing for the artillery. So the artillery was known as the weapon that you could keep operating in foul weather, much more than the muskets. And that did play a big role at Trenton.
Thank you for that. Another question we got was, what did all the American troops that did not cross the river do during the time of the 10 crucial days?
You mean the 2 groups that didn't get across, the southern, yeah. They actually got across within a day or 2 after the battle. When the river cleared up a little bit, they were able to get across. And those were the troops that, if you remember on the map, I had blue dots at Trenton and at Burlington and Bordentown, Crosswicks area. Those were those troops. They did get across. So they participated at the second Battle of Trenton, the Battle of the Assunpink, and then also at the Battle of Princeton. They just missed the first battle.
Okay. Next question is a 2-parter. What was the role of the Quakers, if at all? And in your opinion, was Washington brilliant or just scrappy and lucky?
That's 2 different questions. The Quakers were trying to stay out of the whole thing, right? They wanted to avoid conflicts and things like that. At the Battle of Princeton, they could not avoid it because it was on Quaker farmland that the battle took place. The farmhouse, the William Clark farmhouse, where I said the troops met in his orchard, he was a Quaker. And also Thomas Clark, which is right behind you there, Paul, isn't it? Isn't that your picture?
Oh, yeah, this is the Skilling Farmstead, our headquarters.
Oh, that's okay. I was going to say it looks backwards from the
It's
Thomas
similar.
Clark
It's
house.
similar. Yes.
It's
similar.
reversed. Yeah. I was going to say, did you get your picture turned around there? But no, the Thomas Clark house at the Princeton battlefield is a Quaker farmhouse also. And so the Quakers at the Battle of Princeton had to clean up the battlefield. There were also Quakers in Trenton, but there were also non-Quakers in Trenton who wound up having to clean up the battlefield also. So the Quakers certainly didn't participate militarily, but they certainly participated humanitarily with the wounded and helping to clean up and things like that. And the second part of the question was?
It was Washington brilliant or just scrappy and lucky?
Both. I like to think he was brilliant, but you almost have to, I mean, history is always interpretation, and that's definitely an interpretation. I think the other aspect of it, the luck, is absolutely true. He was one of the luckiest people around. And I don't say that to diminish his brilliance. But when you think about all the times he was in battle with people shooting at him, and he never got touched. When you think about the weather helping him out at the Second Battle of Trenton, particularly, but even at the First Battle of Trenton, keeping him from out of the view of the Hessians as he was marching towards Trenton and that kind of thing, and then making it difficult for them once he attacked to really understand how big his force was. So they initially thought he was just another harassing attack. All of the weather and just I won't say the bad marksmanship or anything, but the luck that none of these bullets hit him. And that goes all the way back to the French and Indian War. He was in so many different combat situations, never got touched.
You sort of touched on this in your answer, but relatedly, is it true that Washington lit campfires the night he left for Princeton in order to deceive the British about his intentions?
Yes, absolutely. The men lit campfires automatically because they wanted to get food, at the end of the day. And they also needed warmth. And Washington, the British had campfires also, let's put it that way. Both sides had campfires. Washington, when his troops left around midnight, definitely wanted those campfires to continue burning strongly, as though they were still serving the function. And he left particularly New Jersey militia behind in order to keep the fires going. And they were not to leave Trenton until just an hour or two before sunrise. And so that was definitely a plan. And it did not totally work. The British did see behind the campfires men moving around and doing things that was suspect, but they just misinterpreted it. I think it's also important to know that Washington forgot to tell some people in his own army that he was leaving. And one person he forgot to tell was Dr. Benjamin Rush, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, but was serving with Washington as a medical man. And he was treating wounded from the Second Battle of Trenton that night at some houses in the Assunpink Creek area. And Washington forgot to tell him that they were leaving. And Rush didn't notice until about 4 o'clock in the morning that the troops had all left. And he was stuck there just with his wounded guys. And so he was able to get some leftover wagons together and he transported them down to Bordentown. But so he didn't go to the Battle of Princeton. And he was kind of mad at Washington because he said Washington took his army into combat again and didn't take a doctor with him to treat wounded. Now, of course, he had doctors. General Mercer was a doctor by profession. Several of the other Continental officers were doctors, but they weren't serving that function in the Army. Rush was definitely serving that function.
Just so you know, we have about, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 questions. Is that within your time frame, or?
I'm okay if you all are.
The next question, actually, I'll skip to the one after that because that's a lot more general. Can you explain Hessians, why they were around and where they're from?
Okay, Hessians were German soldiers. They were German citizens, and their regiments had been arranged by King George III to be attached to his army and come over to the colonies to help defeat the rebels. So the Hessians fought in their own military units, their own companies, their own regiments, their own officers, and all of that. They were professional troops, just like the British were professional troops. I think it's important to know that the British did not use volunteers, or did not use draftees. They only used volunteers at the time of the Revolution. This was a man's occupation, was being in the military. And the Hessians, it was the same thing. They were not farm boys necessarily that were just drafted to go over and fight the colonies. They were professional men whose units were sent over to participate in the war. Sometimes the Hessians get called mercenaries, but that's they're princes. You know, Germany at this time was a bunch of principalities and dukedoms and things like that. It wasn't a unified country. And the princes were the ones who got the money from King George for sending the troops. The troops just got their pay. In other words, they weren't fighting for pay or anything like that. They were going to get their pay anyway because they were in the army. So they were just doing their duty. They weren't mercenaries in that sense as individual men.
We'll loop back to that question that we skipped earlier. Can you tell us anything about the indispensables from Marblehead, Massachusetts?
Oh dear. Well, you're talking about the book called The Indispensables, right?
I believe so. Unclear from the question, though.
I'm assuming since there was a book published not too long ago called The Indispensables, and it's about the Marblehead Regiment, the 14th Massachusetts Regiment, that had a lot of sailors and people who are used to working around boats in harbors and things like that. A number of them were African American, a number of them were Native American, a number of them were foreigners. It was really one of the most diversified regiments in the American Army at that time. Having said that, I would want everybody to know that in Massachusetts and New England in general, there tended to be more Black and Native American soldiers than there were from the other colonies. So almost every regiment had at least a few diverse troops, but the Marbleheaders, the 14th Regiment, had probably the most number. And the Marbleheaders, because they had experience around boats, they had helped Washington escape from Long Island after the Battle of Brooklyn at the end of August during that New York campaign, helping him get across the East River. And Washington was so impressed with all of that that when he needed to cross the Delaware, he was going to have the Marbleheaders take primary responsibility for getting those Durham boats across. They weren't going to be so helpful in getting the ferry boats across, because that was a whole different thing to what their experience was. But Washington fortunately had men who knew the ferry business. He had local men and he had local militiamen whose families operated other ferries on the Delaware. And he had men from Philadelphia where there were ferries. So he was able to use them for the ferries. And the Marbleheaders primarily, they got to row the boats across the river and steer the boats across the river. And you know, in history, regiments and people and all of that gain fame and fortune as much from how their publicity goes as how their actions go, and taking nothing away from the Marbleheaders at all, except that I would want to say that there were other regiments that were also indispensable. They couldn't have done it alone. But you know, they're very impressive, and they deserve a lot of credit.
Okay, great. Next question is, I know that, you know, it's well known that that these, you know, 10 Crucial Day victories help prevent the depletion of soldiers, you know, soldiers abandoning. Did enlistment actually go up at all in any significant way?
Enlistment was a problem throughout the Revolution. When Washington's troops that he had at Trenton had their enlistments expire, you know, he'd been almost begging them to either enlist in the new regiments or at least extend their enlistments for 6 weeks so that he could do more in New Jersey. About half of them agreed to the 6-week thing, and a few of them did enlist in the new regiments, but he lost a lot. He'd lost a lot anyway, as I indicated before. His victory in the 10 Crucial Days probably did help with enlistment for those new regiments, but those new regiments probably never were up to full capacity during the Revolution. I think that's, you know, a good segue into the issue of black men in the Revolution, in the Continental Army. Washington, when he took over command outside of Boston in June of 75, did not want black men in the Army. The only black man he wanted around was his servant, Billy Lee. And some of the officers, he didn't mind having servants, actually slaves. But he didn't want black men carrying muskets and doing the soldier stuff. I mentioned that in New England, the officers had accepted black men. They'd accepted black men in the local regiments in the French and Indian War. This was not a totally unusual thing, and they respected the black soldiers. Some black soldiers got into the military, got into the Continental Army, even though Washington had given orders not to have them there. And what he found out eventually was, and this was pretty early, this was by December of 1775, he wasn't getting enough white men to enlist. And there were a number of black men who offered to enlist. So guess what? He changed his mind. And black men enlisted, you know, throughout the war and served in a great capacity. I mean, that's one reason I'm interested. I wrote about that book that I think I mentioned at the end, The Revolutionary World of a Free Black Man, Jacob Francis. His story, he actually enlisted in the Continental Army on a day that Washington gave an order to the officers not to enlist black men. And then he served for 14 months. And after 14 months, he served for 6 years in the New Jersey militia, including at the Battle of Monmouth and other places, and earned a great deal of respect that carried on after the war for him. So going back to the original question, yes, the 10 Crucial Days helped with enlistment. but it never solved the problem.
Thank you for that. Another question we got was, did Martha Washington ever travel with George Washington?
Yes, particularly winters and winter encampments, long winter encampments. And then, you know, when the army, it was encamped at the end of the war up around New Windsor and that area. And then when they spent the last 6 months in Princeton, right next to West Windsor, she was with him at Rockingham, you know, when he came down and was there for several months at the end of the war. But she was like, you know, she was like at Morristown, Valley Forge, you know, different winter encampments also.
So this is the third to last question before we will close out the lecture. Where was Minister John Witherspoon during these days?
Where was Witherspoon? Well, Witherspoon was away from the area. I mean, he was in the Continental Congress. Okay. I mean, he obviously lived in Princeton and wasn't going to come back, you know, during the British occupation and the battles and all of that. So he was basically away. Now, what about his house in Princeton? Was anybody living there? I don't know if any of his family was living there, but his enslaved people were living there during all of this. There were a number of people in Princeton who left town, but left their enslaved people behind to kind of guard their property. It was kind of a custom at the time that, you know, soldiers that were invading, like the British and the Hessians, if they came across an abandoned property, they plundered the heck out of it. But if a person had left their part of their family behind, or servant, or, you know, somebody, an employed person, somebody to look after their property, then they only plundered it a little. Yeah, didn't go quite full tilt. So a lot of people, including people like Richard Stockton and Witherspoon, left enslaved people behind to take care of the property.
And actually, Maggie, before you ask the next question, I do want to mention that for everyone watching, that the historical study does have a few documents related to, speaking of plundering and, you know, raising, burning barns, yeah, properties that happened in West Windsor too. We have several, yes, show it, especially in the Penn's Neck area, which is the western, I'd say the western portion of West Windsor. Yes.
Yeah, New Jerseyans really suffered during that British occupation, and West Windsor definitely was part of that.
Another question we got was if the route of the Sawmill Road is still visible within the Institute Woods, which I think is in Princeton.
Part of, there's a few little patches of it.
Mm-hmm.
Most of it doesn't exist, but if you go to the Princeton battlefield and talk to Will Krakauer, who's the state historian at the site at the Thomas Clark House, they can point out little bits and pieces of the old road.
Yeah. Okay. And then General Hugh Mercer, you know, when he died, I'm going to reword this a little bit. How did it personally affect George Washington?
Well, Washington knew Mercer very well. I mean, they're both from Virginia. Mercer was from Fredericksburg area, so he wasn't, you know, right at the same area that Washington was, but they knew each other. I mean, it obviously, you know, was the loss of a friend, you know, to George Washington, not just an employee kind of thing. I don't know what else to go, more detail to go into. Yeah, I don't recall any particular statements that he made or anything like that, but I do know that they were close.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we only have okay. We have 2 questions left. We'll end it there. I know I said 3 before, but we really will end it here after these 2. The first one is someone's just asking about the general history of the barracks in Princeton and Hessians residing there.
Did you say that again? I didn't quite catch the question.
Someone is asking, do you know the history of the barracks in Princeton and the, you know, the occupancy?
Oh, Well, the barracks in Princeton, which is, a private home, it's not like the barracks down in Trenton. It's not quite that big. And the building that's there now has been enlarged from what it was earlier on. The original building was a farmhouse, a stone farmhouse in the Stockton family. It was like the original Stockton residence before they developed Morven and, other houses in the area. And I think it's mostly tradition that soldiers may have been stationed there at some point during the French and Indian Wars. Troops did travel through that area, no question. And it's also possible that some British or Hessian troops were stationed there during the British occupation of Princeton. But I think most of the stories, and particularly the ghost stories and that kind of thing, are mostly tradition. They're interesting. They're fun.
I agree. The last question we got was, if you had to pick one important site in West Windsor, where would it be?
One important site in West Windsor in connection with the 10 Crucial Days.
Exactly. Yep.
Well, I think that would be the farm. The farm where right off Route 1, right, Paul?
It's the farm, Jonathan Flock's farm. It might have extended to Route 1. It was for everyone watching. The Larry had mentioned 20, 30 minutes ago that there were scouts who had captured a contingent of British troops in West Windsor. And this house was owned by a man named Jonathan Flock, who himself actually happened to also be in the Washington's army. And so I don't believe he was at the house at the time. But this house was located where the abandoned American cyanamide agricultural research facility is, near the intersection of Clarksville and Quaker Ridge Roads on the West Windsor side. And that, that's where that capture took place. They transported it back to Trenton at that point. So I would agree on that too. That house has not existed since probably the late 1950s, if not the early 1960s. And a lot of people watching this probably know the area better as the Howard Hughes or the Atlantic Realty property. So we really do have to end it there with the question. So I just want to say thank you again, Larry, very much for being here. Obviously this is important national history. It's relevant to the local area. And I'm sure, there are going to be a lot more follow-up questions. So what I would recommend is for anyone who else who has follow-up questions, just email, Larry, do you want them to email you, or we can take some of the questions or whatever. We can.
Why don't you collate them?
Yeah.
So I only get one email.
that sounds good. Okay, so just email us at westwindsorhistory@gmail.com. Again, if you want to learn more about year 225, because this is the first part of a year-long events and celebrations for the town's 225th birthday, just visit our website, westwindsorhistory.com. So again, thank you, Larry, very much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, and great questions. I really enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you, Larry.
And the recording will be available again in a few days.
Okay.
We'll update everyone on that. Okay. Well, everyone have a good night.
Bye-bye, everybody.